why is there life? If you believe in evolution, you believe that things come to be because they are necessary. But why is life necessary? Why would it evolve? Why isn't the universe just rocks and gas and stars and emptiness? Walk with me, if you would. Cross a bridge into a new way of seeing the universe, into a new way of seeing the world. Maybe it'll be an adventure for you. Come on, let's go. Hey, Robert Mitchell here. I'm a martial artist, an author, a seminarian, and a deacon in the old Catholic tradition. So, hopefully that little intro got your attention. So, those of you who are new to my channel, I want to try to introduce to you a different way of looking at Christianity. Those of you who are old friends and who are already consider themselves to be Christian people, some of the things I talk about, this might not be of particular interest to you. This video is mainly at my atheist friends who are having difficulty with Christianity for a number of different reasons. And so what I'd like to do is introduce those people to a different way of seeing the world. Now, I recently started a conversation with a guy who's into science fiction, and he's a pretty ardent atheist. And one of the ideas I'd like to propose to him, and I'm planning on having an actual phone conversation with this fellow, and I wanted to try to pitch this to him, and maybe you'd appreciate it. So let's imagine a science fiction movie. And let's imagine that in this movie it's the far distant future. And then let's imagine that there's a group of people. And this is in the, let's say it's so far in the future that we're starting to see horrible effects of the degradation of the universe. And in other words, we're so far in the future that people are super advanced. The problem is as we know by science, we know that the universe is running down. And then eventually, just as there was a big bang that created the universe, that the universe is expanding to a point where there'll be so much distance between the stars that there will be nothing but blackness and effectively empty space. We do not believe, scientists do not believe at this time that there's going to be an ultimate contraction after that expansion. The universe is going to die. And so in this science fiction movie, let's imagine that these people are struggling with what's going to happen when the universe is so big and so dark and so dilute that there is no life in it. And they receive a message through some subspace communication from another dimension. And this communication is from a being in another dimension who says that there's a way for humanity to escape from this reality, this dimension, into another dimension where there is immortality, life, and light. The problem is that the communication from this entity, which is outside the universe, is garbled, and it's faint. And the language that it uses is so complex and so difficult to understand that the problem is that it's hard to follow its instructions. because our brains are so ant-like and primitive in comparison to this great intelligence from outside that it's very, very difficult for us to understand what it wants us to do. And even more difficult for us to try and articulate it to others. When you do grasp it, it tends to be more of a poetic grasp than it does to be a concrete scientific grasp. Now, the people that get this communication from this alien intelligence they understand that it may take generations to understand what this intelligence is saying. And so they begin a multi-generational project to try to understand what is happening. Over the course of this science fiction, imaginary science fiction movie that I'm relating to you, let's say that these people, after many generations of trying to understand the communications they've received, eventually one of the many things that happens in the course of this science fiction movie is that someone's born who claims to be the incarnation of this alien intelligence. And he demonstrates incredible powers and abilities on the basis of this incarnation. And his DNA is entirely different, and he's not of this world or of this universe. And then he dies and disappears. He then reappears, apparently in material form. And then all of the people that are dedicated to this multi-generational product try to convince the rest of the world that this entity is real, that it's not just from another dimension, but it actually materialized. And then what happens is that it is not believed by pretty much anybody. And how does the movie end? I don't know. So that is sort of a science fiction version of the Christian story. So now let's go ahead and do what I often do, and then go to the blackboard. Hey, so let's compare the Christian story to the science fiction idea that I just put out there for you. Now, let's talk a little bit. I want to use a term, so lay a term on you, and it's functional atheism. And so the idea is that if you're a Christian, then you can step into a functionally atheist perspective so that you can solve problems. And so you leave God out of the equation so you can get a different perspective and you can address things scientifically. And so some of the greatest scientists in the world were also Christian. And so, for example, Father Teilhard Chardin, who was the famous anthropologist, Georges Lemaitre, the famous father, Georges Lemaitre, the famous Belgian physicist, Father George Mendel, the founder of one of the original geneticists. So you have to be able to step into that realm. So for those of you who are viewers of my channel who are atheists, I'm trying to give you a different perspective on the Christian story. And for my Christian followers, watch how I lay this out, and maybe you can use some of this in your discussions with atheists. So we know that the stories in the Bible are thousands of years old. Thousands of years ago, people began to tell mythological stories about the creation of the world, and those mythological stories feed into the story of the Hebrews, who compile their story, which is entirely different. There's another video that I've done a little bit about monotheism and what what it means, that invention means. You can watch that if you want to. But so thousands of years, we don't know how old those stories are. We really, really don't. So they could be as old, or certainly they're similar in some ways to the Enuma Elish. And so these stories could be, let's say, several thousand years BC. We don't really know. So we have these stories that are thousands of years old, and they're put together into the Old Testament, and then later on, we can quibble about the dates. Let's just say 100 AD. There arrives on the scene this figure of Jesus. Prior to that, and then roughly 100 AD, somewhere in there, you can quibble about dates plus or minus some time. But there's a New Testament written. And then for another 2,000 years, thousands of people thousands of compilers are working on this multi-generational collaboration. Now, are there contradictions to some extent in this multi-generational story that's compiled by thousands of people across thousands of years? Yes, there are some contradictions, but it is a library of 73 books. It is not a book, it is a library of 73 books. And over there I have I think it's a 1920 Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm pretty sure it's got less than 73 volumes. I think it's 29 or 30 volumes. And I can tell you there's probably some contradictions in that. But that doesn't mean that there's no truth in it. So we have to understand, you see, that this is the science fiction story that I laid out as a model earlier is interesting. It's an interesting way to change your perspective, because you have to think about the fact that religion is the science of consciousness. Religion is the science of consciousness, and so, let's say, Copernicus's view of the universe is far different than, let's say, Carl Sagan's. And just because those two men, if they could have a conversation, they're both deceased, but if they could, they wouldn't agree on everything. But that doesn't mean that we don't throw cosmology out of the window, or astronomy. So we have, across thousands of years, we have thousands of compilers working on a multi-generational collaboration that's eventually compiled into 73 books. Now, what is that book? Well, how was it done? So let's acknowledge this. It was done with no modern technology. There was no internet, no file sharing, none of that. And yet it is the most viral book of all time, or the most viral library of books. And those of you who understand the internet and use the internet a lot, you click on an article and then the article has links in it. Well, the Bible has links in it too. Way before the internet, it has 63,779 links. So, if you look at it from that standpoint, it's amazing just for that. So, what I mean by links is that if you look at, let's say, a reference that Christ makes, then that's a reference back to a passage in an earlier psalm or somewhere else from the Old Testament. And these things go back and forth and back and forth 63,779 times. You cannot, just because there are a few minor contradictions in the story in some points, you can't dismiss the fact that the overall narrative is overall is consistent. Even if you are an atheist, or you just put yourself in a functionally atheist headspace, you have to admit that this is something like climbing Everest 1,000,000 times. It's incredible to think that across thousands of years, thousands of compilers could work on a multi-generational collaboration of 73 books without modern technology that contains 63,000 links and maintains a consistent narrative and becomes the most viral story ever in the history of the world. Now, let's bear in mind too that it wasn't even legal to be Christian. It wasn't even remotely okay to be Christian until Constantine becomes emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's persecuted on top of all that. When it first starts, let's put this into perspective too. So now we think about this. So the Jews have consistently told this story, and they've told this story warts and all. And what I mean by that is that if you look back at the story of every great patriarch. So Moses kills an Egyptian and has to flee. David is the great Hebrew hero who slays Goliath, and he is a great king, and he's super great and wise and awesome. But then he ends up becoming filled with corruption and becomes a killer. And so all of these great biblical heroes, they don't even gloss it over. It becomes the most viral story in history, despite the fact that it tells a story completely devoid of any attempt to make it clean. They don't clean it up at all. They tell the story right there in your face with all the dirt and all the grime. And so many people pull apart the Bible and say, well, it's filled with violence and it's filled with all this bad behavior and so on. Well, guess what? That's what people do. And that's one of the things that makes it so fantastic, is that it's a warts and all story. So what they expected, the authors up to this point, up to the Jesus point, they were expecting a king. Despite all of David's faults, they were expecting a king. They were expecting a great king who would drive out and destroy all the enemies of the Hebrews and reestablish the temple and all that stuff. And so what did they get? Did they get that? No. They got a carpenter not a soldier. And despite the fact that they didn't get what they wanted, they continued to tell the story, warts and all, because we find out in the New Testament that his disciples don't get it. They just don't get it. And it says it repeatedly. They don't understand. They get confused. They have no idea what he's trying to talk about. He has to go into parables and the whole bit. And then what happens? One of them betrays him. One of them, the one who goes on to found his church, denies him 3 times. So, all of this happens. The disciples don't get it. Now, the people that wrote the book are the disciples, and why the heck do they tell a story that paints them in such a negative light? Because they are determined to tell you a story that is true. That's why. Now, despite the fact that for thousands of years leading up to this, they were expecting a soldier and a warrior king, not a carpenter. They got a guy who didn't come with a physical sword, who came with a sword of ideas. So despite all of that, does he do anything he was expected? No. He dies on a cross, which is the most degrading, vilified, horrible way you can possibly die in that day and age. And after he's gone, they're persecuted, incredibly, heavily, deeply persecuted. Now later on they would have cathedrals and incense and great art, and all that stuff would grow later. But in that time, they had, and we know that these people were big on curing the sick, and they cared a lot about widows and orphans. And then they invited in the sinners, and they invited in all manner of people. And so they weren't meeting in cathedrals, and there was no stained glass, there was no Rocky music, there was no triumphant montage, because there was none of that. What you had was poor, sick people meeting in small homes, trying to figure out what was going on. Trying to tell a story and comprehend it. And the story is one of what? Escape from suffering and evil. And despite all of that, somehow it becomes the most viral, world-transforming story ever conceived of. If you're an atheist person, I hope you at least will admit or come to terms with the fact that it is incredible. And then the one thing I would leave you with, and I need to make space, so I didn't leave enough space for this, but it is completely unique. Completely unique, 100% unique. So you have to admit at least that, and that it is the greatest underdog story ever told. And then you may say, Mitch, do you believe it? You're damn right I believe it. Thanks for watching.